Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. I feel acknowledged now. My name is Dr. Joan Reed. I'm Dean for Diversity and Community Partnership at Harvard Medical School and want to welcome you to our Alvin F. Poussaint Visiting Lectureship. Dr. Poussaint is someone well known to our community. He's a professor of psychiatry emeritus. He served as faculty associate dean for student affairs at Harvard Medical School until his retirement just last year. An amazing commentator, a consultant to government and private agencies, someone who has fought for justice and civil rights for decades. He's a graduate of Columbia and Cornell and did his training in psychiatry and Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA. But I think the thing that we know most about Dr. Poussaint and we hold up is his deep commitment to improving the lives of others, from children all the way up through our medical students and into our faculty. He's someone who has dedicated his life to making sure that others' lives are better. And so this lectureship was actually established by alumni of Harvard Medical School to honor him. And really as an opportunity to bring people back, people who have graduated from Harvard Medical School or been involved in our training programs, an opportunity for students to meet them, for our community to see the great works that people are doing, and a time for them to say thank you and to honor Dr. Poussaint. And today we have Dr. Charles Bridges. He's the Global Chief Technology Officer in Pulmonary Hypertension Therapeutic Area at Janssen Pharmaceuticals, where he leads the development of novel therapeutic devices and the application of advanced data science methods to solve problems. From 2015 to 2018, he was the Global Vice President of Cardiovascular Therapeutic, an area expert for Johnson & Johnson Medical Devices. And there he worked on high-profile investments and acquisitions in the cardiovascular and neurovascular space. Before going to J&J, he had an illustrious career where he was full professor of surgery at the University of Pennsylvania, chief of cardiac surgery at Pennsylvania Hospital, and professor and chairman of cardiovascular, thoracic, and vascular surgery at Carolinas Healthcare System in North Carolina. Well published, over 180 publications and 12 patents. Someone who, like a lot of people would love to be able to say, over 2 decades of steady funding from NIH, which speaks to his research. But he's someone who cares, again, deeply about Dr. Poussaint, about where we are now in medicine and health, but also where we are now in our country in terms of diversity and inclusion and having a space for everyone to be able to achieve their potential. And with that, Dr. Bridges.
Great. All right. So this is an outline. Let me put this microphone works better, I was told. Here we go. This is an outline of what I'll talk about. I'll review the current status of black enrollment in medical schools in the U.S. Where are we and why are we here? And throughout this talk, I'll talk about black. When I say black, I mean of African ancestry. African American, I more specifically mean blacks born in the U.S., most properly those who are descendants of slaves. When I say Muslim, I'll be talking both about those of Arab and Persian descent. I'm going to go all the way back in time a bit, particularly since this is Black History Month, and start 4,000 years ago with a very selective review of the recorded history of science, technology, some aspects of engineering, art, and mathematics, and my view will be in marked contradistinction to conventional Western and science education. And why history matters is that a balanced view demands, in my opinion, that we resolutely reject the African inferiority hypothesis, because there is such a hypothesis, and that's been articulated since the Renaissance. And I will also discuss Amy Chua's somewhat controversial book called The Triple Package, a hypothesis for why certain groups, including several of West African descent, have been extremely successful, and I put that in quotes because success is how you define it. But for the last 400 years, African Americans, also of Western descent, have been intentionally and systematically excluded from some of these avenues of success. And why, at the end of all of that, I'm still quite enthusiastic about our future. I will not discuss enrollment in engineering or advanced degrees in science, since the trends there roughly parallel those in medicine, and in the interest of time. Also, as I mentioned, I will particularly focus on that subgroup within underrepresented minorities, particularly U.S.-born black males. And this is intentional and not meant to be divisive. It's because of how critically different this subgroup is in many respects from the other groups of underrepresented minorities. Nonetheless, many of the strategies and issues apply to black and brown applicants and professionals more generally.
In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In most instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark did and see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you like to play with?
Get a little bit more sound.
She's white. And can you give me the doll that looks like you? 15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll.
The results of Drs. Kenneth and Mamie Clark's doll test in 1940, these results were used 14 years later in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 to successfully argue against the doctrine of separate but equal. A more current spin on the doll test, featured in a special by CNN in 2010, found that more recently, black children have increasingly rejected the notion that the black doll was inferior. They say things like, "I like them all the same," or "color shouldn't matter." This progress is encouraging. However, there's been no change in the perception of white children. Black parents have made progress in enlightening our children that blacks are not inherently inferior. However, white parents have not. The implications are sadly obvious. Those who disproportionately control money and power in Western society continue to believe from early childhood that black is synonymous with inferiority and evil. This is a quote from my daughter, Hillary Bridges, who is the executive director and founder of an organization called Black Heritage Academy in New Haven, Connecticut. And I'll read it with some excerpts derived from an article on child development. According to research studies such as the Clark's doll test, black children have a lower collective self-concept than white children. Self-concept is directly correlated with overall success. However, our current educational system does not address this issue. It teaches what M.K. Asante calls a white self-esteem curriculum, neglecting to include the contributions of people of African descent or the role that the American system of racial oppression played in forming and continues to play in perpetuating the disparities we see today. It teaches false notions of black laziness and inferiority and allows myths of white productivity and superiority to continue. In addition, a recent study shows that beliefs that the American system is fair and just undermine the well-being of marginalized youth. Black students are detrimentally affected by the inaccuracy and omission surrounding issues of race in public education. The lack of truth and inclusiveness in American public education makes it imperative that black children have their own spaces to develop positive racial identities. If a system is fair and just, and you are suffering disproportionately within that system, the message is clear. The problem is you. It is not the system itself. This thesis then justifies inaction and reinforces notions of African inferiority, and in its worst manifestations, provides illegitimate confirmation of white supremacy. My daughter, the founder of the Black Heritage Academy in New Haven, concluded, independently of me, by the way, and probably before me, make sure I say that, and I agree that black children need their own spaces and need to understand the doctrine of what, in my own words, I'm calling African excellence throughout this presentation, and the systematic obstacles that Africans and our ancestors have overcome. Only we, their parents, uncles, aunts, mentors, and friends, can teach them about African excellence because the public and private education systems do not acknowledge these truths. What I am saying is not politically correct in some circles, including among some of us. Depicted in the graph is the number of black male medical school applicants in bars versus percentage of black applicants who matriculated. The line, 1978 to 2014. There's a decrease in the number of black male applicants, but no change in the percentage matriculating since 1978, in spite of a significant overall increase in medical school applications during this period. As we will discuss later, there's been a substantial decrease, over 50%, in U.S.-born black male matriculants during this same period. On the left are some quotes from the article, which was written, lead authored by Dr. Cato Lorenzen, a good friend of mine and well known to this audience. Negative media depictions of minorities can result in an internalization of stereotypes that can affect educational achievement. Another challenge involves the high probability of black males attending underperforming schools, teachers that lack cultural awareness, and black males need black physician role models within their communities. And furthermore, the average black graduate of medical school has substantially more debt than others. Dr. Lorenzen, I just cited you. You'd be happy to know. Let's see, so where was I? Okay. This is pretty self-explanatory, also from the same article. Only 37.8% of black applicants are male. This is in contradistinction to every other racial and ethnic group on this slide, where at least 50% of the applicants are male. So the point here is, again, there's something unique about what's going on with males and blacks within the underrepresented minority group as a whole. And what are some of those factors that we'll talk about? This slide demonstrates the overall number of medical school applicants by race and ethnicity. This is the pointer word. Let's see. Doesn't look like I can get a pointer to work here. That's okay. Is that it? Nope. That's not it. And what you'll see, I think the most interesting thing here is the relatively flat. If you look at the red line, which is black applicants, it's essentially flat. There's a slight increase, but there's a doubling of Hispanic applicants, and matriculants rather. There's sort of a compensatory decrease in white matriculants and a compensatory increase in Asian matriculants. But the small increase in black matriculants is completely accounted for by black females. There's been no movement in black male matriculants. This is a slide that I borrow from Montgomery Rice, who's the president and dean of Morehouse School of Medicine, Beyond Flexner Conference in 2018. Some salient facts here are that 52% of African American males graduated from high school. This was in 2012. Only 36% enrolled in college. Only 33% of those graduated from college. The incarceration rate for black males is 3,074 per 100,000 residents. In contrast, for whites, it's 6 to 7-fold lower, and for Hispanics, it's more than 2-fold lower than for African American males. One of the reasons I started with the doll test video of 5-year-old black children is that a key thesis of what I'll talk about here is that although programs addressed at graduate student level and enhancing black faculty academic promotion are important, in order to meaningfully address these issues, we need to focus most of our effort on earlier childhood education, both inside and, equally importantly, outside the traditional classroom. African excellence will only be taught to our children, I would argue, by us. This slide is pretty self-explanatory, showing a significantly lower rate of college graduation among adults over age 25 for blacks and Latinos compared to whites and Asians. And for all of these groups, with the exception of Latinos, and that's another interesting discussion, those who are foreign-born have higher rates of college graduation than those that are U.S.-born. Relatively flat numbers of black matriculants to medical school depicted on this slide from 2002 to 2015, but a greater than 50% reduction in matriculants from historically black colleges and universities. While Lonnie Guinier and Henry Louis Gates Jr. attracted national attention to the fact in 2003 that a minority of black undergraduate students at Harvard could claim a, quote, completely American black heritage, the percentage of African Americans remains substantially higher at historical black colleges and universities. Therefore, the decline in applications from historically black colleges and universities disproportionately affects the enrollment of African Americans in medical school. Unabashedly, just as with other racial or ethnic groups do and continue to do, we must espouse excellence. Excellence is not innate and can have the demonstrated positive attributes without the potential downside, which are historically fresh experiences with slavery, Nazi Germany, and perhaps the current administration in Washington should make apparent to all of us. Examination of the crisis reveals a more disturbing discovery again here for native-born African-American applicants. The percentage of U.S.-born African-American males has not exceeded 17% for first-time applicants or 22% for matriculants during the period from 2013 through 2017. Taken together, these facts imply that the number of U.S.-born African-American males matriculating to medical school has declined by approximately 60% since 1978. If one considers the expansion of U.S. medical schools, the decline is likely to be even greater. I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the 4,000-year recorded history of science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, part of what I will talk about in terms of African excellence, a view, again, which is in marked contradistinction to conventional Western art and science education. A balanced view leads one to conclude that the contributions of Africans throughout history and throughout the diaspora are remarkable, significant, and deserving of recognition. A review of 17 textbooks of physics and physical science published since 1970 show that of 186 photographs, 94 scientists, not one of black or Latino origin, is depicted. The history of science typically begins with the contributions of Western European scientists in the 17th century and ignores the 4,000-year foundations of mathematics and astronomy originating in the written record, earliest in Africa, and subsequently in Greece, Asia, and the Middle East. As a bit of an applied mathematician, at least in my younger days, a few weeks ago, I solved the truncated pyramid problem myself. I approached it as a moderately challenging calculus problem and was able to derive the correct formula depicted here. 1/3 a squared plus ab plus b squared, where b is the diameter, the side length of the square at the top, and a at the bottom, and h is the height. What is fascinating was that not only did the Egyptians solve this problem 4,000 years ago, but in 1900 a European mathematician proved that the only way to arrive at this general solution is to use the methods of integral calculus, which would not be invented till 3,600 years later. Thus, it is one of the mysteries of mathematics how the Egyptians were able to arrive at an analytical solution that would not be possible until the end of the 17th century, when Gottfried William Leibniz and Sir Isaac Newton, who are credited with the invention of calculus, invented that area of mathematics. So how did the Egyptians solve this problem is a mystery of modern mathematics. The great periods of mathematics concluded the Egyptian, Hellenistic, and Muslim, and arguably all peoples and continents, and independently in India and China, these mathematical techniques were also developed. In fact, the great library in Alexandria, Egypt, was the center of science and mathematics from 300 BC till the dawn of the Roman Empire in 31 BC. Many of the greatest mathematicians of the time, Euclid, who wrote Euclid's Elements, it's debated whether he was actually one person or collected the works of a number of people. Archimedes, who developed the most accurate estimate of pi around 250 BC using the method of exhaustion, which was the closest thing to calculus we had 2,000 years after the Egyptians had already developed a formula which arguably derived only from calculus. And Eratosthenes, who also lived around 200 BC, 275 BC, was the first to calculate the circumference of the earth. All worked in the great library in Alexandria. Eratosthenes was born in modern-day Libya, which is in North Africa. Euclid was born in Alexandria, Egypt, if he indeed existed as a single person. The point is, just as Jesus is depicted as Western European, these are deliberate choices of how we depict people. We have no idea what Jesus looked like. We have no idea what in fact, we don't know if Euclid was even an individual. We don't know what Eratosthenes looked like. The concept of appropriating accomplishments of North Africans and others of African origin is rampant throughout post-Renaissance European history. Continues to this day. At the Academy Awards, all the Academy members were jamming to Eminem's rap music, the most recent of many original black American art forms that were not well accepted until they had been co-opted by others. When I tell my American friends with PhDs in science from prestigious institutions as we debate about Iran that Persians had a significant role in inventing, it's astonishing to me that most are completely unaware of this fact. Or if I tell my cardiac surgical friends that Vivian Thomas, a descendant of slaves, invented and perfected the first successful open cardiac surgical procedure for congenital heart disease, the Blalock-Talsic shunt, the subject of an HBO special called Something the Lord Made, many of them are unaware. In fact, when Blalock did the first Blalock-Talsic shunt, Vivian had to enter Hopkins through the back door because blacks weren't allowed in the front door. And there are some great photographs of Blalock performing the operation with Den Cooley to his left and Vivian standing on a stool behind Blalock looking over his shoulder, instructing him in how to perform the operation because Vivian perfected the operation. The program endeavors to pair 5 million young adults disconnected from stable career pathways with the 12 million jobs that are waiting. They have a 90% placement rate. They get college credit. You accomplish this in 1 year. They have 5,000 graduates to date, and the student in our office is doing an amazing job. So there are opportunities that where we can demonstrate progress. Well, there's a book that I read recently called The Triple Package. It's by a woman, Amy Chua. Some of you are familiar with The Tiger Mom, which was also a controversial book. And in her, she discusses 7 ethnic groups in America that are disproportionately successful. That depends on how you define that. But she includes college degrees, income, positions of power, influence. Not surprisingly, Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, and Jewish Americans are among the 7. What some don't know is that Nigerian Americans are also among that 7. That Indian Americans were number 1 with 70%. Nigerians and Jewish Americans were tied for number 2 with 58 and 59% respectively. Chinese Americans were number 4 with 52%, and U.S.-born white Americans were 50% lower with 29% college graduates. She defines 3 elements common to all 4 groups. These are her words: superiority complex, insecurity, and impulse control. On superiority, she notes that immigrant Indian Americans have grown up in many, not all, have grown up in a caste system where notions of superiority are often ingrained. Jews have been told for millennia that they are God's chosen people. Greeks contend that they invented science, which there's some evidence that definitely says that that may very well be true. Chinese are reminded that China ruled its region of the world exclusively for 5,000 years. And many Nigerian Americans are Igbo or Yoruba, described as, quote, the Jews of West Africa or descendants of royalty, respectively. So let me talk about this, because it's controversial and I know it. On superiority, my notion is of what Amy calls superiority is what I call African excellence. Like their Jewish, Greek, and Indian counterparts, children of African descent must be convinced of their own excellence, that they are inferior to no one, and that they can accomplish anything that they set their minds to. Black children in America particularly should also be reminded of the injustices that they have overcome against all odds to be successful. On insecurity, she notes that these successful immigrant groups have a fascinating duality. They both have a notion of superiority, i.e. their innate ability, yet insecurity. We must work constantly to be sure that we achieve, because success is never guaranteed. I would argue that as people of African descent in America, we have insecurity largely built in. We know, for example, we can be shot by the police in the backyard of our own home with a cell phone in hand, and the explanation is we thought he had a gun, so we shot him 20 times. That's a true story. Stephen Clark, Sacramento, 2018. On impulse control, not only do you need to work constantly, but it may take years or even decades of hard work before you see tangible benefits. This takes role models to understand and believe that this is true. This takes resilience to believe that it's worth getting up when you fail, because you will see success ultimately in your future. And perhaps this is where my personal triple package came in. I went to a Quaker elementary school, so the idea of inferiority did not occur to me in that environment. And by the time I was out of there, I already had my own evidence that I probably wasn't inferior. So I was pretty good in checking that box. On insecurity, I think as an African American, you don't really have to discuss why you feel insecure, because you ought to feel insecure. It's called driving while black. And on impulse control, my father, I grew up in a lower middle class row home in Germantown, Philadelphia. My mom was a school teacher. My father had been a school teacher and had been a chemist, but was not working. My mother was helping him to go to medical school, and we were living on one teacher's salary. And I remember when I was about 4 years old, that's about when he started medical school. I was about as tall as the doorknob. And whenever I wanted to find Dad, he was always in the room studying. He was always in his bedroom with the door shut. And, perhaps that's where I learned a little bit about if you work hard and you study hard, good things can come from that. But I think for blacks in America in particular, the triple package is not enough. We need the quadruple package. We need resources. I think in America it's going to take a multi-billion-dollar investment over 2 decades to overcome 400 years of slavery, terroristic murder of black people, Jim Crow, redlining, the funding structure of American schools where the poorest districts get 50% less funding than the more affluent ones, the disproportionate imprisonment of black men, the ongoing issue of murder of unarmed black men, the resultant disproportionate poverty and debt, unequal opportunities for MDs, PhDs, and high school dropouts alike, and then a final grab bag of ongoing racism of all its varieties. We must entreaty America to invest not because of the goodness of his heart, but rather because closing the achievement gap makes economic sense for all of us. The United States ranks behind more than 33 advanced industrialized countries that make up the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development when it comes to math and science scores. If the U.S. matched Canada, ranking number 7 on this scale, closing the achievement gap, and then making some additional progress, America's gross domestic product is estimated to increase by 6.7%, which is a cumulative increase of $10 trillion by 2050. I would argue that closing the achievement gap is not just good for blacks and those of African descent and those underrepresented minorities. It's actually good for all of us, and it makes economic sense. That's the argument, frankly, that I think we need to make to the Gates Foundation and to the Bloombergs of the world, those that have the resources, and to the government that have the resources to actually approach these problems in scale. We have a habit of small pilot programs when we have a multi-billion-dollar problem. You know, Johnson & Johnson just contributed $150,000 to the roundtable. Well, I'm happy that we did, and we'll hopefully repeat that every year for 3 years. But it's not a $150,000 problem. It's not even a $150 million problem. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem that we're really facing. And then finally, a composer that is unknown to many, known as the Black Mozart, or as Barclay says, or as Mozart the White Chevalier. I'm just going to have you hear one of his compositions as a closing. Of a slave and a slave owner. Also the best composer in France at age 20, the best fencer in France at age 20, and a general in the French army. Some of his innovations in music were adapted by Mozart and others. As a fencer, the idea of dueling violins as part of the violin concertos was a theme that he developed and Mozart and others adapted. So I encourage you to listen more to more of his music. Thanks very much.
To take some questions or comments.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
There's 2 people with microphones. So I'm going to, how did you find out about him? So one of the things is we come up with these stories of individuals, but how do you find out about them? How do you, and then how do you tell others?
I think it's a great question. I think that unfortunately, a lot of this history is lost. That's the only, one of the good things about the internet is that so much of the data, the extant data in the world, including the Moscow papyrus that shows the Egyptian calculation 4,000 years ago leading to that formula, it's out there now in the digital world. All the data that exists, most of it, a lot of it is out there. And honestly, with complete transparency, it was really just searching on the internet, looking for things. I had this sense, this instinct that, if African Americans are so disproportionately successful in popular music, they must have had the opportunity to do classical music as well. And it was that sort of inspiration, that intuition that they must be there, that led to me discovering this one, and there are many others that are not. And then, why don't we hear about them? When we talk about Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms, why don't we talk about Chevalier de Saint-Georges? We could. See, depending on how if you spin history your way, he'd be right there. But if you spin it in a way where you want to diminish those contributions, then you can relegate him to the dustbins of history, which until very recently, I'm not sure, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I don't think very many people know of him or of his music. But it sends a very powerful message, just like the 100-year-old woman who just passed away, who was one of the mathematicians, on the NASA project. It's amazing how it lifts people to see those examples, that you only need a few examples of success to really feel that you too can do. But if you see none, and if in your environment there are no doctors, there are drug dealers, and they have the most money and the best cars, that sends you a message that's the way to go. And if you don't know anybody who studied hard and don't have the fortune that I did, that even though I don't think of myself as growing up very privileged, both of my parents were college graduates. That's very unusual for an African American, 60 years ago. And so I was privileged, and I think that needs to be the common scenario, not the uncommon scenario.
Thank you so much for such a educational presentation. My question is, it seems like the history hasn't been told through our books. How can we include that in our books? And if not, how can we, the families, show or teach our children about this? And my second question is about resilience. Those of us who didn't get the chance to get that information through the educational system, and who are not fortunate enough to have the resilience of some our colleagues have, how can we teach that to our youth?
Well, in this book that Amy Chua writes, she talks about, there are groups, we can talk about Jewish people or, and the same thing's true, not just Nigerian people. If you look in Britain, both Ghanaians and Nigerians outperform whites in their educational systems in Britain. So this is not unique to America. This story is as to why some folks have figured out how to, accomplish certain things in Western societies. But what she also talks about is that you don't have to be part of a group. You should think about your own your own family. And that's the way I think of it, is, you can create that excellence, that role modeling, and that sort of insecurity that says, the extreme version is, what the hell's the matter with you? You got an A-. That may be taking it a little too far, perhaps. But, we can create these structures in our own homes.
I wanted to hear more about why you are optimistic about the future.
Well, because I think that the solutions, I mean, you know, there's evidence of how to fit. I mean, there are programs where you can increase black male graduation from college by 60%. There are groups of arguably the same ancestry that are substantially outperforming Americans on average by the measures that we use. So therefore, it's achievable, right? And even she would argue, people say, oh, well, the reason Chinese students do so much better is because they're just inherently smarter. She, a Chinese American, actually refutes that theory. She says that even IQ for IQ level, certain groups outperform others, Chinese people in particular she's talking about. So her theory is it's not, you know, it's about these extrinsic factors, okay? That's her theory. And so we can manipulate extrinsic factors. We have to do it intentionally, and we have to do it at scale. One of the things I learned in big pharma, J&J, the largest healthcare company in the world, you know, if we're trying to create $1 billion drug, we'll throw $100 million at it. We're not going to throw $100,000 at it because it'll fail. And that's the way we're treating this problem. You know, we're trying to create 10 trillion in GDP over the next, you know, through 2050 by closing the achievement gap, but we want to throw $200,000 at that problem. It's a much bigger, to reverse 400 years of systemic, I mean, I only listed 10 factors. I could go on, you know, there are more. But, you know, that's not going to happen overnight. And it's not going to happen by accident. It's only going to happen. And so it's who do you elect? Because, you know, to our government, you know, we have billions, we have trillions of dollars, actually, depending on who's running it and where they decide to deploy it. So the resources are there to fix the problem. And so I guess my view is if we know there's a solution and we know there are the resources, it just takes the creativity to get the two together and to motivate people to realize that it's actually in their benefit to do this, to do so. So that's why I'm optimistic.
So when we're looking at extrinsic factors and we're working on African American children's school success, one of the things we discover is they are getting far less sleep than white American children. And this is actually getting lower, not better, in the past decade. Some of this relates to trying to sleep in difficult environments. Some of it relates especially to high school kids also having jobs as well as trying to do school. But it strikes me that this is an intervention that has a possibility of making an enormous difference. I wonder if you have any ideas about channels through which we could make this happen.
I wish I had an easy answer to that. You're saying black children don't get as much sleep.
By a lot.
Right, but that ties into the fact that 70% of African American children are in single parent households, whereas only 25% of other folks in the United States are. And, you know, it's hard for one parent, you know, who's working, you know what I mean? I mean, there's so many issues that you can't overcome. Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. If you have a brilliant idea, that certainly help. Get the Gates Foundation to give you, you know, $50 million to fix that problem. Honestly, no kidding. I'm saying I think you're right. I think there's so many. I mean, black children are also not as well nourished when they come to school, right? They not only have not had enough sleep, they haven't had enough to eat. And they're in an educational system in Philadelphia, public schools. There are 35 children and one teacher with a budget of about $8,000. This is 5-7-year-old data. Maybe it's a little more now. It's 10,000 or 11,000 per student. In the suburban public schools rather, where my daughters went to college, one of whom attended Harvard College, by the way. At the time they were spending $9,000 in the Philadelphia public schools, they were spending $21,000 in our neighborhood. And when my kids went to elementary school, they not only had, there wasn't one teacher with 35 kids, it was one teacher and a teacher's assistant with 20 kids. So, I mean, how can you take 35 kids who haven't had enough sleep and who haven't had enough to eat? And in fact, Joan was giving me an example of the so-called AP biology programs that she was helping to develop and they discovered that of the 12 laboratories required for AP biology, they only did half of them. So, I mean, if you don't do the laboratories, you won't pass the test. It's that simple. So I think there's a huge issue around just the way we allot resources in America. That doesn't happen in India. In India, if you live in the poorest neighborhood, you don't get a 50% reduction in how much they spend on schools. That doesn't happen in Europe. These are some of the legacies of American marginalization of one specific population who used to be slaves, frankly, and with whom we're very comfortable with them having almost no opportunity except an extraordinary, there are always extraordinary people that overcome, you know, all odds, like Ben Carson, you know, raised by a single mom to become a neurosurgeon at Hopkins. But yeah, you know, I mean, the scales are tilted against certain populations intentionally. So you can only undo it intentionally.
Hi. For those of us who will have an opportunity to either influence or lead departments or research labs, how do we get so specific without creating tension within our particular professional spaces? I think there was a great article written by you, Doctor, about how we tend to lump diversity into one group.
Right.
To make it easy for everyone to kind of digest and swallow. So how do we?
Well, I think we have to speak out about it. At Johnson & Johnson, you know, when we talk about, you know, managers get measured on metrics of diversity. Unfortunately, diversity, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but diversity has become gender diversity to the exclusion of ethnic and racial diversity in many cases. You get to check the diversity box. You know, when we go through the so-called promotion process at J&J, for every candidate that gets reviewed, well, they say, well, are you a diverse candidate or not? Check, right? Female, check. Female daughter of an executive that's a billionaire that went to Phillips Exeter and Harvard, you check the diversity box. So is that really what we need to be thinking about? I would argue not exclusively, right? It is one of the factors because gender, there are gender-specific issues. I don't care how much money you have or where you came from. But we need to take a more, and that's what Dr. Lorenzen has really articulated well in his science article, which I would encourage all of you to read, that we have to start getting more granular about how we talk about diversity if we see that certain subgroups are again being intentionally or unintentionally left out. So I think it's okay to talk about it.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation. I'm a psychologist, so I want to give your name. I'm a past president of the American Psychological Association. I want to give your name to our leadership because this talk would be important for psychologists to hear. And I mean, I'm not just saying just them, but to hear from someone who is in a different so-called profession, but to talk about relevance to us, we end up being very narrow in terms of our thinking. And so I want to thank, I'm so glad I came because I would like you to come and speak at our international meeting because people need to hear this perspective. It is not narrow, it is inclusive. And you were wonderful, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
When talking about the crisis of black men in medicine, I was just wondering if you had any strategies or suggestions in terms of how to frame the issue to get collective buy-in from everybody in terms of solving the problem and moving forward and making changes.
Of blacks in medicine or black men in medicine?
Black men in medicine.
Black men in medicine. I think it really is, there are a number of targeted programs that you can do. Morehouse, if you look at, I didn't show that slide, but if you look at the largest number of black matriculants to all medical schools, I'm pretty sure it's Morehouse, is providing the largest number of students. And way greater than their percentage of black students in America. So we need to emulate the kinds of things that are being done in those institutions that are extremely successful. Developing programs like the one at the University System of Georgia that specifically targets, and I know here at Harvard Med School I learned today that there's a group, African American, I don't know if it's African American or black, Johnson & Johnson, for example, we have these resource groups, and we used to call it the African American Leadership Council. We now call it the African Ancestry Leadership Council because, the African diaspora in the United States is much more diverse than it was 25 years ago. Yet we all face some of the same issues, certainly. And so, I think that some of those kinds of programs, I think, need to be emulated, more generally.
I have a question about something you alluded to earlier, which was speaking of check boxes and checking diversity boxes and excluding people, which is that black immigrants tend to be overrepresented in the black category, in the STEM fields. And I'm wondering, as an immigrant, and I know I have, of course, benefited a lot.
You have benefited?
Definitely,
Okay.
from programs, that are for blacks and African Americans. So I'm wondering, at what point do we address this issue? Because I do think it's an issue, but it's also beneficial in some way, because I do think that representation is helpful to this overall parity, achieving parity.
Right.
So I'm wondering, at what point do we address this issue?
Yeah, no, okay. So you're talking about the issue of immigrant black families versus African American descendants of slaves and competition for a fixed number, what appears to be a fixed number of slots, right? It's kind of like Harvard hasn't changed, not Harvard Med School, but Harvard College has largely not changed the number of black students since when I was there and now. But the composition of those students has changed, which then means that this particular subgroup that were born in the U.S. has shrunk dramatically. So then it can
Not
get into
just-
an us versus them situation, which
Right.
it should not, right? It is not a zero-sum game, in my opinion. We need to address the issue, if it's about U.S.-born black men in particular having issues, we have to address those issues. It's not a competition. Frankly, I love to see blacks of all African ancestries here at places like Harvard successful, and because it's not a zero-sum game, right? As Asian Americans have demonstrated, they're overrepresented. So there's no reason to say that any group can't be overrepresented. The goal is to achieve excellence individually and also within however you want to define your group. But it's increasingly hard to label yourself anything. So my bias is we create systems where families, it could be churches, espouse excellence and achievement and go about putting those elements in place, because it's not us competing with them. It's not all of us competing with another group. That's not what it's about. It's about getting people the greatest opportunity and trying to make the playing field close to level, which it's not, and it's not going to be, and it's going to take a generation at least. You can't undo 400 years of history in 20 years. You can't do it, you know, and that's what we're up against. We're up against 400 years of history.
Larger picture of what's going on systemically in terms of the enrollment of minority students and black students over time. When I first came here in 1969, I felt we would solve the problem in a couple of years, or 10 years the most, by health careers summer programs and recruiting students to the medical school, that we would overcome all the disparities in a very short period of time. I was so ignorant or so wrong at the time, because I think one of the issues that they are still dealing with is the entrenched issues around the legacies of slavery and the entrenched issues around white supremacy and white superiority in the culture, which runs very, very deep. And I like their optimism, but at the same time, I wonder about the direction of the country and a lot of the core people in America that would like all of this not to happen, would like it to go in the other direction. So I commend Charles and the others for continuing to address the systemic issues and problems that continue to plague and hold back not just African Americans, but also members of other marginalized groups in America. So continue the battle, the fight, the struggle, whatever you want to call it, but keep on. Thank you.